Her teeth were gone by 25, and nobody thought to write it down. She is standing at a kitchen table with a heel of bread in her hand, and she bites, and something in her mouth gives way that shouldn't. Not a crumb, not a crust catching wrong. A whole tooth, root and all, lying there against the bread like a small gray stone. She doesn't scream. She doesn't even stop chewing for very long. She works her tongue into the gap, tastes the iron of it, spits once into her apron, and goes back to the loaf because the bread is what there is, and the day is not going to wait for her mouth to catch up with itself. She is 26 years old, and this is the fourth tooth she has lost this way, cleanly, without a hand near it, in 18 months. She will lose the rest within the decade, most of them before her 30th birthday, and when they are gone, she will not think of herself as unlucky. She will think of herself as unremarkable. Every woman she knows past 30 has the same collapsed look at the mouth, the same practiced way of laughing with the lips closed, the same private understanding that a wedding and a baby after it and another baby after that cost you something in the jaw the way it cost you something in the back and the knees. Nobody wrote it down because nobody needed to. It was simply what a body like hers did, by a certain age, in a certain kind of life. We are going to follow her mouth from its beginning to its emptying, because a mouth, it turns out, is one of the most honest records a poor life leaves behind. Bones can be reset. Skin heals. But a tooth, once it is gone, is gone. And the ones that are missing tell you almost exactly what a person ate, how many children she bore, what kind of work wore her down, and how far she was, in practical terms, from anyone who might have helped her keep them. She starts, like every child starts, with a mouth of milk teeth that come in stubborn and crooked, and are mostly forgotten by the time they fall out on their own. In the cottage or the court or the back-to-back she is born into, weaning does not mean vegetables mashed soft and given by the spoonful in careful portions. It means whatever is cheapest and fills a small stomach fastest. And by the middle of the 19th century, across the industrial towns of Britain, that increasingly means bread soaked in tea, bread spread with treacle or dripping, and, as soon as a household can afford it at all, sugar. Sugar had been a luxury for the wealthy for centuries, taxed and rationed by price rather than by law, kept out of poor households less by regulation than by cost. That changed, and it changed within living memory of the woman we are following. Duties on sugar were cut through the middle decades of the century and effectively abolished by the 1870s, and the price of it fell so fast and so far that a commodity once reserved for the tables of the comfortable became, within a generation, the cheapest way to make a child stop crying and a poor dinner taste like something. Consumption in Britain rose steeply across those same decades, and it rose fastest and hardest among exactly the households that could least afford anything else, because sugar, unlike meat or milk or fresh vegetables, was the one luxury that had become genuinely affordable to the poor, and they used it the way anyone uses the only luxury within reach, generously and often and starting in infancy. So she grows her second teeth into a mouth that has already known, for years, the daily habit of sweetened tea, treacle on bread, sugar stirred into porridge, penny sweets bought from a corner shop the moment a farthing could be spared. She is not being poisoned by cruel parents. She is being fed, lovingly, in the cheapest way available, by people who have no reason to think of sugar as anything other than nourishment and kindness, because no one around her has told them otherwise. And there is, in her world, almost no one whose job it is to look inside a child's mouth and say that something is going wrong in there. There is no dentist for a family like hers. There is, in most of the towns she might have grown up in, no such profession accessible to her at all. Dentistry in the middle of the century is unregulated, expensive, urban, and built for people with money, and it will not become a licensed profession with any legal standard until an Act of Parliament in 1878 begins, slowly, to separate trained dentists from the men who simply hung out a shingle. Even after that, licensed dentistry remains a service for the middle class and above. For a girl in a mill town, a cavity is not a problem to be treated. It is a fact of life to be endured, the way weather is endured, the way a bad winter is endured, and the ache of it becomes something you simply carry, on and off for years, the way you carry any other low, chronic discomfort that nobody has offered you a way to fix. By the time she is old enough to be sent out to work, 11, 12, 13, depending on the household's need and the local custom, Her mouth already carries the early damage of a decade of cheap sugar and no correction. And the work itself does nothing to slow it. If she goes into a cotton mill, her days are built around long stretches of standing labor broken by short pauses. And in those pauses, the fastest, cheapest way to get calories and a jolt of energy back into an exhausted body is sweetened tea, bread, and treacle, jam if the household can run to it. Mill owners and reformers alike noted, across the middle and later decades of the century, how central sweetened tea had become to the rhythm of factory life. Not a treat, but a fuel, taken in fast, powerful gulps. Exactly the pattern that does the most damage to a tooth, already weakened by years of the same habit in childhood. If she goes into domestic service instead, she may eat slightly better, on her employer's leftovers and a servant's allowance, but the tea remains sweet, the hours remain long, and the toothache, when it comes, remains hers alone to manage on her half-day off, with whatever she can afford or borrow or beg. And toothache, in her world, has its own quiet economy, running entirely outside anything we would now recognize as medicine. There is oil of cloves, bought in a small brown bottle from the chemist, or carried from mother to daughter as a household remedy, dabbed onto the gum, or soaked into a scrap of cotton wool and pressed against the aching tooth, numbing it for an hour, sometimes two, before the pain claws its way back through. There is whiskey or gin, held in the mouth against the bad side, swallowed or spat, depending on the day and the desperation. There is laudanum, tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, sold cheaply and without restriction at chemist shops right through the century, marketed for coughs and colic and women's complaints, and quietly for exactly this: a few drops on sugar or in water, enough to dull the nerve until sleep became possible. It is not dramatic. It is not a scene of screaming agony. It is a woman doing what a woman in her position does, managing pain with whatever is cheap, legal, and at hand, night after night, for as long as the tooth holds out. And when the tooth does not hold out, when it abscesses, when it swells the whole side of the face, when the pain becomes the kind that no dose of clove oil touches, there is the tooth drawer. He is not, in most towns she might live in, a dentist in any sense we would recognize. He might be a barber carrying on a trade that had linked hair cutting and bloodletting and tooth pulling together for centuries, and had not entirely let go of the old association even as surgery and dentistry began, elsewhere, to separate into their own professions. He might be a blacksmith whose hands are strong and whose forceps, or pincers repurposed for the job, are the only tool in the parish built for gripping something and pulling it hard. He might travel with a fair, setting up at the edge of a market square once or twice a year, sometimes with a small band playing to cover the sound of what was happening in the chair, sometimes advertising loudly to draw a crowd who came half to watch and half because their own tooth had been aching for a month, and this was the only chance they would get. There is no anesthetic worth the name available to her. Ether and chloroform exist by the middle of the century and are used in the operating theaters of hospitals for the wealthy. But they reach the tooth drawer's stall at the edge of a country fair, slowly if at all. And for most of her life, the extraction she eventually has is done exactly the way it would have been done 100 years earlier, quickly, with force, with someone's knee or hands holding her head steady, and with the expectation that she will simply bear it, because bearing it is the only option on offer. She bears it. She loses the tooth, and the abscess drains, and the relief afterward is so total, after weeks of grinding pain, that it feels almost like a cure rather than a loss. She does not yet understand that this will happen again and again, and that each time it happens, the space in her mouth where a tooth used to sit will not be filled by anything because nobody in her circumstances is offering to fill it. And there is no institution whose job it is to notice that a woman, not yet 30, is losing her teeth at a rate that would, in a wealthier household, have been treated as an emergency worth solving rather than a nuisance worth enduring. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Did anyone in your own family, a grandmother or great-grandmother, ever mention losing teeth young, or was it simply never talked about the way so much of this was never talked about? There is a folk saying that ran through working-class households in Britain and across much of Europe for generations. Some version of it in every dialect, a tooth for every child. It was not superstition dressed up as science. It was, in its blunt way, an accurate observation of something real happening in a woman's body. Pregnancy and lactation place heavy demands on a woman's calcium reserves, and in a body already undernourished, already carrying the accumulated damage of a childhood built on bread and treacle, and a young womanhood built on factory tea. Those demands were met in part by drawing on the calcium already present in the jaw and the teeth. Add to this the specific and well-documented vulnerability of the gums during pregnancy, swelling, inflammation, a heightened susceptibility to decay and infection that period medical writers themselves noted, if often in vague or moralizing language, without understanding its full mechanism. And you have a body in which each pregnancy left behind not only a child, but a further debt paid, quite literally, out of the mouth. She marries in her early 20s, as most women of her class and period do, and by the time her second or third child is born, the process that began with a childhood spoonful of treacle and continued through a decade of factory tea has entered its final stage. The teeth that ache do not simply ache anymore. They loosen. They crack under ordinary pressure. They come away, as we saw at the very beginning, from something as unremarkable as a bite of bread. By 25, or 26, or 28, the precise age varies from woman to woman, and the surviving evidence does not let us pin it to a single number, only to a widely observed and widely accepted pattern. She has lost most of what she started with. And here is the part that matters most, the part that separates her experience most sharply from anything a modern listener has lived through. Nobody around her considers this a tragedy. It is not spoken of with pity. It is not spoken of much at all, because it does not need explaining to anyone who shares her world. Her neighbor has the same sunken look at the mouth. Her own mother had it by the same age, if she lived long enough to reach it. The women she works beside, prays beside, buries children beside, share this one specific permanent visible marking of a hard life, and it is worn the way calloused hands are worn, or a stooped back from years bent over a loom. Not hidden exactly, simply absorbed into what a woman like her looks like by a certain point in her life. What she cannot have, in almost every case, is a replacement. Dentures exist. They have existed in crude forms for a very long time, and by her period they are more sophisticated than they had ever been. But they are also, overwhelmingly, a luxury item made and fitted for people who can pay for them, which she cannot. The materials themselves carry their own uncomfortable history. Through the earlier decades of the century, a significant portion of the false teeth in circulation were not manufactured objects at all, but real human teeth, pulled from the dead and reset into denture plates for the living. The most notorious source, so widely used that the resulting dentures picked up a nickname that stuck for decades afterward, were teeth gathered from the battlefield dead of the Napoleonic Wars. Young men's teeth, healthy and strong from years of hard living, cut short, harvested in the aftermath of the fighting, and shipped back to be cleaned, sorted, and set into the mouths of the wealthy under the label of Waterloo teeth. That trade, grim as it sounds now, was considered simply practical at the time, a sensible use of a resource that would otherwise go to waste, and it continued in various forms. Teeth pulled from executed criminals, from the desperately poor willing to sell their own healthy teeth for cash, from the bodies passing through hospitals and workhouses, for much of the century, gradually declining as porcelain and, later, vulcanite bases made manufactured dentures more available and somewhat less expensive to produce. Somewhat less expensive did not mean within her reach. A full set of dentures, made and properly fitted, remained through most of her lifetime a marker of comfortable means. Something a shopkeeper's wife or a clergyman's daughter might have, and a millhand's wife, in the overwhelming run of cases, would not. If she gets anything at all in the way of a replacement, it is more likely to be a cheap, ill-fitting shop-bought set, sold ready-made rather than fitted to her own mouth, uncomfortable enough that she may keep them in a drawer for special occasions and go without them the rest of the time, which is itself a small, private cruelty layered on top of the larger one. A solution that exists technically, but exists just out of reach in exactly the way that dental care itself had always been, just out of reach for a woman in her position. The gap between her mouth and the mouth of a wealthier woman her own age is not, in this period, a difference of vanity. It is a difference of class made visible in the single part of the body hardest to disguise, and it will remain that way for most of her adult life. The women who could afford early dental care, softer diets less dependent on cheap sugar and starch, and eventual replacement of what was lost, kept something she did not get to keep, a working, presentable, pain-free mouth into old age. It was not that her body was made differently. It was that her circumstances made almost every stage of the damage: the childhood diet, the working conditions, the repeated pregnancies, the absence of any dentist within either geographic or financial reach, the crude and painful nature of what treatment did exist, cumulative, compounding, and, by the time she reached her mid-20s, essentially irreversible. Change, when it finally came slowly, unevenly, and largely for the generation after hers rather than for her. Toward the very end of the century and into the first years of the next, dental and medical reformers in Britain, some of them the same voices pushing for better sanitary conditions in factories and better food standards in workhouses, began to argue that the state of working-class teeth was not simply an unfortunate fact of nature, but a public health problem, and one that started in childhood and could, in principle, be caught early. The founding of professional dental bodies in the 1880s had already begun the slow work of turning tooth pulling from a trade practiced by barbers and blacksmiths into a licensed medical profession with its own standards. Then, in the first decade of the new century, the introduction of school medical inspection in Britain brought for the first time a systematic and official look inside the mouths of poor children. And what the inspectors found, recorded in official reports with a bluntness that reads almost shocking now, confirmed in cold administrative language everything her own life had already demonstrated without a single word written down. Widespread, severe decay, untreated abscesses, children in genuine chronic pain, sitting in classrooms, having simply learned, as she had learned, to carry it. It is worth pausing on the shape of that change, because it did not arrive as a single reform sweeping the country and fixing things overnight. School dental inspection led, slowly and patchily, to school dental clinics in some districts and not others, to campaigns encouraging toothbrushing and cheaper toothbrushes in poorer households, to a gradual generation-long shift in how ordinary people thought about a child's teeth, not as something you simply waited to lose, but as something a person might, with effort and some outside help, actually keep. That shift came too late for her. It came in time, unevenly for her daughters, and more fully for her granddaughters, and it is worth remembering when you next hear someone talk about how far dentistry has come, that the distance being described is not really measured in the decades of scientific discovery, so much as in decades of a basic service finally becoming available to people who had always needed it and had simply never been able to reach it. She lives out the rest of her adult life, then, in a mouth that has finished changing shape by her late 20s, and will not change again, except to settle further. The jaw slowly reshaping itself around the absence of what it once held. The lower half of her face taking on, by middle age, the sunken look the period photographs of working women from this era show again and again if you know to look for it. Not a look of illness exactly, but a specific recognizable mark of a specific kind of life. She raises her children, buries some of them, as women of her period so often did, goes on working as long as her body allows it. And if you had asked her, at any point along the way, whether her teeth troubled her, she would very likely not have understood the question as you meant it. Of course they troubled her. Everyone's did. It was simply what happened to a woman in a body like hers, in a world built the way hers was built. A fact of life absorbed so completely into the texture of ordinary existence that it barely needed remarking on, and so it wasn't, by her, or by almost anyone around her, which is exactly why it survives now, mostly in the bones themselves, in old dental surveys and school inspection reports, rather than in anything she ever thought to say out loud. If any part of this stayed with you, the tooth drawer at the fair, the folk saying about childbirth, the strange history behind a set of Waterloo teeth. It's the kind of history this channel keeps returning to, the body as a record of a life rather than a footnote to it. And if that's what you come here for, it's worth staying for what's next. She is not a name in a register. She is a pattern, repeated across hundreds of thousands of women, whose lives left almost no other trace, and the pattern is the truest thing we have left of them. A childhood sweetened cheaply because cheap was all there was. A girlhood and young womanhood spent in work that offered no time and no means to slow the damage. A marriage and a string of pregnancies that finished what the sugar and the labor had started. And a mouth, by 25, that had already told the whole story to anyone who knew how to read it, long before the reformers arrived with their inspection reports and their statistics to write it down at last.